So thank you for joining us for this month's installment of our online speaker series. If this is your first time joining us, the First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit located in Augusta, Maine. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences here at the First Amendment Museum. And we do rely on gifts from viewers like you to continue the work we do. So if you enjoy this presentation, whether you're watching it live or watching it on YouTube or our website sometime in the future, please consider donating to us. And also you can check out our website for future 2022-2023 speaker series installments, along with some of our past speakers installments. And there's all sorts of other great opportunities and content on our website and on our social media. We have a wonderful selection of online presentations coming up after tonight's, all of which are free. And the recording of today's lecture will be available later on our website at firstamendmentmuseum.org and on our YouTube channel. So, and also stick around after the presentation tonight for a Q&A with our speaker. If you have questions you'd like to ask during the course of the presentation, please put them in the chat if you're on Zoom or in the comment section on Facebook. And we will ask some of those questions and give some answers after the presentation. So without further ado, tonight we are joined by Kate Koff, an investigative journalist for the Maine Monitor, a media outlet based here in Maine, a graduate of Bryn Mawr and Columbia University. Did I say that right? Bryn Mawr? I'm always confused on how to pronounce that college name.
Bryn Mawr.
Bryn Mawr. Okay.
You're close.
Graduate of Bryn Mawr and Columbia University. She's previously a reporter and then the digital media strategist for the Ellsworth American. While there, she won awards from the Maine Press Association and the New England Newspaper Association for her work on where local recycling really winds up, how businesses are coping with the labor shortage, and a local network of kind of investigating a local network of white supremacists, among other things. So that's quite a variety. So interested to hear about that and more. Kate, we're excited to have you and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you tonight. And I have a short presentation, something for you to look at instead of my face while I do this. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. And as I was telling Max, we have a 3-week-old baby, so it's been a while since I've done Zoom, and I'm also, if she stirs downstairs, forgive me. There's not a whole lot I can do about it. All right, so let me get this started here. Just 1 second. Okay. Max, can you see that okay? Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, looks great.
Looks great. Okay. All right. Well, so first of all, thank you again to the First Amendment Museum for having me. I'm really happy to be here. As Max mentioned, I am a investigative reporter for the Maine Monitor. So I cover energy and the environment for the Monitor. I also write the Monitor's climate newsletter, which is it's a free weekly newsletter. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Maine Monitor, we are a nonprofit investigative news outlet. We're also based in Augusta, although we actually all work remotely. So I live on MDI, and that's where I work from. We also rely on grants and donations to do our work. And we do not have a paywall. We offer all of our journalism for free. And we also distribute our work to outlets around the state. So you may have read some of my stories in the Bangor Daily News or on Maine Public or Portland Press Herald. We allow outlets to republish our work without, as long as they give us credit, they can republish our work. So my work is also supported by Report for America, which is a national service program that places journalists in local newsrooms to report on undercovered issues and communities. The Monitor is actually lucky enough to have 3 RFA reporters, myself, Samantha Hogan, and Rose Lundy. And if you don't know anything about RFA and you're interested in journalism, I urge you to check them out. It's a really unique program, and I really can't say enough about the support that they've given the Monitor and myself. It's not only financial support, but it's also training and mentoring. So as Max mentioned, I am a graduate of Bryn Mawr College and Columbia University, but I was born and raised in Portland. I'm actually an eighth generation Mainer, which, one of the facts of myself I'm most proud of. I graduated from Bryn Mawr College, and I actually did not plan on going into journalism. So I actually went to medical school briefly before I became a journalist. It's a whole nother life and a whole nother story, but I went to medical school, and I didn't finish. I left partway through, and and I was looking for a new career, and I kind of had no idea what I wanted to do. So I did some informational interviewing, and I talked to a lot of people. Anybody who had a job I thought was interesting, I called them and I said, hey, can I talk to you about your work? And I talked to a journalist who is a friend of ours. He's been in the business for a long time. And he said to me, I don't know, I don't think you should go into journalism. It's really struggling. It's a hard business. And I'm very glad I didn't take his advice. So he's a wonderful man, and we've we've talked about it quite a bit since then. But anyway, so I left medical school. I took a year off or so, and then I was lucky enough to be accepted into the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and I spent a year there. And I actually did a kind of an addition after I was done. I did a data journalism intensive data journalism program for about 3 months, and came back to Maine, and I got a job at the Ellsworth American, which is a wonderful local weekly paper. And as I mentioned, I was there for about 3 years, and I moved to the Monitor. I guess it's been maybe a year and a half now, and it's just been wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work in both of those places. I thought that what I could do is really just share a couple of stories that I've worked on, talk a little bit about them, and the process that we went through, not only to get the stories, but also just to report on them and what that looks like, and a little bit of background and kind of some fun anecdotes that don't make it into the piece. So I thought I could start with talking about one of my favorite pieces I've ever worked on. It is about taxes, which doesn't really sound very sexy, but it is actually so fascinating. And I'll say that, one of the things I really love about my job is that I get to learn something new all the time. And it's often something I know absolutely nothing about, and I go into it pretty blind. And then by the end of it, I know enough to be dangerous. And it makes my job really fun. So this story, for those of you who aren't familiar, this story I started working on actually in 2019 when I was at the Ellsworth American. And it came about because I was the city reporter, and so that meant I went to a lot of local board meetings, planning board, school board, city council. That was part of my job to go and cover all those meetings. And, some were more interesting than others, but I went to pretty much all of them because you never know what you're going to find. And one day I went to a Board of Appeals hearing. The Board of Appeals, they hear, in most towns, they hear challenges basically to tax assessments and tax appeals. So if somebody says that their tax bill is wrong, they can appeal it to the local board, and the board is typically made up of 5 to 7 people, and they'll make a decision. Is this person right? Did they get this tax break, or is the city right? So in this case, I remember I got the notice for the Board of Appeals hearing, and the notice said that Walmart in Ellsworth was appealing its valuation. And I thought that was, the notice didn't say a whole lot about it. It just said, they're appealing their valuation and they're going to have this hearing. And I thought that was pretty odd. on its face because Walmart, first of all, the store was not that old. And I knew that they had just done a multi-million dollar renovation. And so I wondered, why would they possibly be asking for a tax break? So, I went to the hearing, and I remember like I walked into City Hall and I was so excited. I thought, oh, this is gonna be really interesting. Maybe I will get to see these big corporate attorneys from Walmart, and they'll come and they'll argue this case. Like I was expecting kind of a, not a showdown, but a pretty interesting hearing. And I remember I walked into the room and, no offense to, I don't think Larry is here, but Larry is the city assessor for Ellsworth. He's a wonderful man, and I was happy to see him. But I was pretty disappointed because it was Larry and the board, and no one from Walmart had shown up. And this was a pretty open and shut case. Walmart had asked for this abatement, but they didn't show up at the hearing. And so, Larry, the assessor, made his case, and the board accepted the city's, what the city had said. And that was basically it. And so I went back and I was starting to write up the story, and I called Larry because I had a couple of questions, and I was talking to him about it, and we talked a little bit about what the sort of strategy behind this actually was. And he told me that actually this was not something that Walmart was just doing in Ellsworth, but they were actually doing it all over the state. And they were actually doing it all over the country, and they weren't the only, big corporation to be doing this. And they were making a really, sorry about that. They were making a really unusual argument. And essentially what they were saying in all of these cases is that these open stores, which were, they were thriving, busy stores. In some cases, they were only a couple of years old. And they were saying, actually, they were going to the towns and saying, actually, you shouldn't be assessing these stores as though they were new and open. You should be assessing them as though they're these big empty warehouses, because eventually we're going to vacate them and we won't be able to sell them for nearly as much as, it costs to build them. And so they're not actually worth that much. And that's a pretty weird argument on its face. It would be kind of like if you bought a house and the town said it was worth $400,000, and you lived in it, you maintained it, and then 3 years later you go to the town and you say, well, actually, yes, I live in this house now, but someday it's going to be empty and nobody's going to keep up with it. And so actually, it should only be worth $200,000. And so my tax bill should be cut in half. So that struck me as really unusual. And Larry, the assessor, told me, no, that, they do this, not only do they do it all over the state, but they're making these appeals every single year. And essentially the strategy is to kind of overwhelm towns, most of whom just don't have the resources to deal with this, overwhelm these towns and kind of bully them into getting these tax breaks. So I was like, wow, this is a much bigger story than just this one kind of Board of Appeals hearing. But so I was at the Ellsworth American at the time, and the Ellsworth American is a print newspaper. It's a wonderful print newspaper for those of you who haven't read it. It's been around for 170 years. And in print, we work on really tight deadlines. So I had 3 days to get this piece out the door if I wanted to make our print deadline. And I really wanted to make our print deadline for a couple of reasons. One, I didn't want another news outlet to kind of get a hold of this and scoop us. But I also just felt like, this needed to be out there. This is a really interesting piece, and I wanted it to be out there in the world. So I got to work. I am, for anybody who knows me knows I am a huge fan of spreadsheets. So I made a big spreadsheet. I looked up all of the Walmarts in Maine. I made a list of them and the towns that they were in. and a list of the contact information for all of the assessors. And I started to make phone calls. I called about 20 towns in that first day and a half. I didn't get a hold of all of them, but I think I did around a dozen interviews on the phone. And then I did, the rest via email. And for all of these towns, I said, hey, what is your Walmart worth? When was it built? Have they asked you for a tax break? How much have they asked you for? Did you give them a tax break? And the more people I talked to, the more it became clear that this was really a strategy to wear down the staff in these towns. And a lot of them were exhausted. And some of the towns had actually given the companies these tax breaks just because, they really were spending so much staff time and so much money on it that it became kind of overwhelming for them to deal with it. And so in some cases, these companies, and I should say this is not, we focused on Walmart, but, and Walmart does seem to be sort of the most frequent filer of these tax abatement requests. But there are a number of other companies that do this as well. Lowe's, Home Depot, a number of companies, large corporations do this. So anyway, it became clear that this was a real strategy, and the strategy was basically that they would kind of overwhelm towns with these requests and make them year after year after year, and force the towns not only to spend time on this, but also in some cases, they had to hire outside attorneys or appraisers or assessors to look at these buildings and kind of back themselves up. And then once the appeal was denied at the local board, the company, which it almost always was, I can't actually think of a case in which it wasn't. So the appeal would get denied at the local board, and then the company would take it up to the state board, which is kind of the next step in the process. But it turned out that the state board, which is made up of, it's a volunteer board, essentially a volunteer. They get a small stipend, but it's a volunteer board, and the volunteer board was and frankly is still just overwhelmed by these cases. I mean, they had dozens and dozens that they just couldn't get to. And there weren't enough people on the board as well, which kind of became a whole nother thing. So anyway, that was the strategy of these companies. And then these cases were just languishing at the state board, and the towns were really, it was really hard for the towns because not only were they spending time and money on this, but they also weren't sure if they were going to have to give back, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tax revenue, which is a lot in a small town in Maine, as you all know. So this is just the original piece that I wrote for the Ellsworth American, but I have followed the story throughout the years. So one of the kind of most egregious examples that we came across in reporting this story was at the Walmart in Thomaston. And so the Walmart in Thomaston, it was built in 2013. And it was built because Walmart had a location in Rockland, just down the road from Thomaston. They had a location in Rockland. They decided they wanted to expand because that location was doing really well. So they went looking for a new spot, and a few miles down the road in Thomaston, they found some land. They built a Walmart supercenter, and they closed their Rockland location. So the Walmart supercenter in Thomaston cost $28 million to build. And a few years after it was built, so I think it was 3 years later, the company went to the town, and the town had the building assessed at $16 million. And the company went to the town and they said, yes, we just built this building, and, this is a brand new open store, but we think the store is actually only worth $9 million. And they justified it by pointing to the Rockland store that they had just closed. And they said, look, we had this Rockland store and we just closed it, and we were only able to sell it for $3 million. So that's all. That's, not very much in the world of these big box stores, right? And you think, well, that kind of makes sense. If you look at if they're not going to be able to sell it for very much money, maybe we should lower the tax value. But there's a real catch in there, which is that when these companies close a location and sell their store, they put in place deed restrictions. And so the old store cannot be used for anything remotely close to what it was, what it initially was built for. So for instance, that old Walmart in Rockland, it became an Ocean State job lot. But let's say like a Home Depot or Lowe's had wanted to move into that warehouse, they would not have been able to, because there were deed restrictions on the property saying, you can't sell home goods or tools or groceries or anything like that. So they're really limiting what the property can be used for, and then they're selling it for a lot less, and then pointing to the sale of that and saying, well, look, it sold for a lot less, and so this new store we built is also not worth very much, because it's not going to be worth very much when we sell it. So, this is kind of a wild argument, right? But it has worked in some places around the country. And we compiled data. Actually, we made I don't think this spreadsheet is scrollable here, but we compiled all this data and found that since 2015, these companies have asked for, tens of millions of dollars worth of reduction in valuation, and they have gotten hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tax breaks from towns around the state. And so, this is really costing these towns money. It has a real impact on budgets, and it's also just very stressful for town staff who are trying to figure out how to manage this. So after we published this story, this is one of the most rewarding parts of my job, is getting to see what people actually think of the work we do. So after we published this story, we got a flood of letters to the editor of people who were really frustrated with this, and we also got some notes from legislators who said, we're going to try and do something about this. We really need to help these assessors. And so there was actually legislation passed in, I believe it was April of this year. It took a couple of years to get through, but there was legislation that was passed, which is aimed at kind of helping assessors and essentially codifying in statute what that cities have to take into account the revenue that's coming into the building, and that they can't necessarily look at these old shuttered warehouses as comparable properties. So we'll see if that legislation actually helps. I think people have said to me, well, these companies really they have so much money and they have a lot of attorneys, and so it's not necessarily going to stop them from filing these appeals and these abatement requests, but it at least gives the assessors and the towns kind of something to point to and say and back them up. So that was really kind of interesting to see. I certainly don't go into my work with any kind of, I did not go into that story thinking like we must get legislation written to deal with this problem. But it is, I think it just points to kind of the value of local reporting, and that it's fairly likely that, there was nobody else in that Board of Appeals hearing. So it's not unlikely that if, we hadn't been there and hadn't been able to send a reporter, that this might have kind of gone unnoticed. It had been happening unnoticed for years, and at least now, it's out in the open, and we can all kind of figure out what to do about it. And another thing that came out of this piece was this was sort of some information about the State Board of Property Tax Review, which it turned out had really kind of been languishing. There had been vacancies on the board, and the people on the board are appointed by the governor. And, there had been just it had taken years in some cases for people to get appointed. They had maybe been asked or they had wanted to be on the board, but it had taken years to get through the process. And now I think there has been, since these pieces have come out, there has been a little, assessors have called me and said, thank you, like that there's a little more attention on this now. And I believe there were a couple of appointments made to the board this spring. So they now kind of have a full roster and they can go forward and start reviewing these cases and getting rid of some of this backlog. But it's still going to take time. I think they have 33 cases or so that they are still working to get through. So it's going to take a little while. So that was such a fun story to do. I knew nothing. I knew nothing about taxes. I knew nothing, about assessing and how that process works beforehand. So it was really very fun to do that piece. Another story that was just so fascinating was something that I did recently for the Monitor. It was a piece about and you may or may not have seen coverage of this, but this was a piece about the plans of the family behind the Worcester behind Wreaths Across America, so the Worcester family. They have proposed building a $1 billion park in the woods of Washington County with the world's tallest flagpole, and and a lot of other things. They have a hotel, they want to have a hotel, they want to have restaurants. I think they've got 8 miles of loop roads. They have gondolas, museums, a theater, campgrounds. So it's a really big project. And I came across this story. It had gotten some coverage in the local media. It had been covered by the Ellsworth American. I think the Portland Press Herald had written about it briefly. But the stories, I didn't think anybody had really dug into the plans yet. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Washington County, but it's very rural, and a project like this just sounded huge for this place. I mean, it really sounded like it was going to change the character of the area. I live nearby, and it's mostly woods. It's beautiful woods, but it's mostly woods, and putting all of that infrastructure up there would just have profound effects on, the economy and housing and the roads, and really it would touch just about everything. So I started reading a little bit more about it, and I started reading about not only the project itself, which there wasn't much out in on the internet about the project other than what had been reported on in these pieces. But it also turned out that one of the things they wanted to do for it was to annex the land that where they wanted to build. So they wanted to. The Worcesters own quite a bit of land up in Washington County, and they had decided they wanted to build this project on land that they owned, I think it's about 2,500 acres, up in Washington County near Columbia Falls, but in the unorganized territory. So the land they wanted to build it on was essentially, for planning purposes, under the jurisdiction of the state. It was under the jurisdiction of the Land Use Planning Commission. And so the Worcesters said, we would like Columbia Falls to have, because Columbia Falls is going to be the closest town and is going to be the most affected by this. They said, we'd really like Columbia Falls to have the most control over the project. So they went to a legislator, and they said, would you sponsor a bill to annex this land and bring it under the control of Columbia Falls? Annexation is a two-part process in Maine, so it has to be approved first by the legislature, and then it has to be approved by the voters of the town where the land is being, brought into the fold, so to speak. So the first step was to get somebody to sponsor this bill. Annexation is pretty unusual. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen, it tends to be, you know, it tends to be approved by the legislature. I think since 1985, they've approved all but two of the requests for annexation. So, you know, we're a home rule state. The legislature is pretty, you know, really wants towns to have control. So if a town wants to bring land into its borders, they say, you know, let them vote on it. So, but this annexation was unusual when I started reading it, reading about it in, you know, for a couple of reasons. One, it was requested essentially by a citizen, by this company, which typically when a town annexes land, it's usually the town asks to annex, you know, it's at the town's request, and they ask to annex land because there's maybe some development there that they want to bring it, you know, bring into their borders so that they can get the tax revenue. As far as I could tell, this was the only case in which a company or a person had come to the town or, you know, come to the legislature and said, you know, we want to annex this land. So it was unusual in that regard. It was also pretty unusual because there's a provision, and I will get down to this slide here, but there is a provision in Maine statute that says if you are going to annex land that is under the jurisdiction of the Land Use Planning Commission, the Land Use Planning Commission essentially retains control over the land until the town adopts ordinances that are at least as stringent as what the state has in place. So the Land Use Planning Commission will work with the town to help develop these, you know, these ordinances and make sure that when the land is transferred, that, you know, the rules, the ordinances governing what goes on there are at least as protective of the environment and natural resources as what the state has on file. That is how it's typically done. But this was unusual. This bill was unusual in that it stripped those protections away. So there were just a couple of sentences in the bill that said the Maine Land Use Planning Commission will have no jurisdiction over this once this bill is passed, and once the voters of Columbia Falls approve it. So that was pretty strange, and I thought, you know, I need to know more about this. So I called the Worcester family, and they very graciously agreed to let me come up to Washington County and to see the land that this was going to be built on. And they also took me through a presentation of this, and I'm going to just share some of the photos that they, sorry about that, share some of the photos that they shared with me to give you an idea of kind of the scale of this project, which is really pretty outsized. So this is, you know, like I said, this would be the main street. It's it's 900 feet long. There were going to be thousands of employees, several thousand employees, villages, campgrounds, a hotel, a theater, all kind of in the woods of Washington County. So these are a couple of renderings. So they are going to have double-sided walls to display. So this park is to honor, I should say this park is to honor veterans. So the company would like to have these 9 miles of these double-sided walls to display the names of 24 million veterans. There are going to be 55 different areas for these walls, one for each U.S. state and territory. The center of the park will be a flagpole. It's the largest flagpole, and I believe the largest, or one of the largest flags in the world. The flagpole will be 1,776 feet above sea level, so it's taller than the Empire State Building, for those of you keeping track. And it will be on about 2,500 acres of land. This is a rendering of the flagpole itself, and one of the observation decks. So there will be several observation decks where you can buy tickets and go up and see the view into Canada and beyond. It'll be quite the view from up there. This is a rendering of what one of the a section dedicated to the Revolutionary War would look like. So as you can see, this is essentially a small city in the woods. And then this was sort of, I believe, that one of kind of the entrance areas to the park. So this is just a little excerpt from the actual bill, and as you can see, the underlined piece, it says the Maine Land Use Planning Commission retains no authority over the comprehensive plan of or any land use activity in the town of Columbia Falls after passage of the referendum. So that's the piece I was talking about, where they kind of take away the protections that are typically allowed, afforded in this law. Pretty unusual. And so the plan was to bring this land into, under this jurisdiction of Columbia Falls. So Columbia Falls would be responsible for the oversight of the park, for all of the planning process. It's a huge undertaking. And Columbia Falls is a town, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a beautiful little town. It's a town of 476 people. And, like a lot of small towns in Maine, they have a volunteer fire department. It's a very small town. They have most of their boards are volunteer. They have a volunteer planning board of a few people. They have, a volunteer select board. And their ordinances are about 15 pages long. So this is an excerpt from the town's ordinance. This is essentially the 2 pages where you have to, talk about the type of building you want to build. And so, as you can see, this is like a lot of small towns in Maine, they are fairly fine with letting people kind of do what they will with their land. And so this is a fairly non-restrictive ordinance, and it's certainly not anything close to what the state, the regulations that they would have to go through for the state. And I should say that, this project would still have to go on, through the DEP and through DOT. But in terms of local ordinances, it would be, if the land is eventually annexed, this, this would be kind of what they were, well, at least right now, this is what they're working with. Although, so the town really is, trying to figure out what to do about this. They have not yet annexed the land. They are actually considering a moratorium on projects like this. So, we'll kind of see what happens. But anyway, so kind of getting back to the story a little bit, I did go up. The Worcesters were very gracious. They took me on, I was with them for about 3 hours, and I got to I did do a little tour of the land, and I talked to Rob Worcester about the project at length. And then I called a lot of people. I went to a planning board meeting. I talked to people in Columbia Falls. I talked to the people who sponsored the bill, and we wound up writing a pretty comprehensive story about the project. It got a lot of we got a lot of feedback from that story, and the town, I think a lot more people started coming to the planning board meetings, and the town really, like I said, they're considering, they've kind of pushed back the vote on the annexation. They are considering a moratorium on these projects. I'm not sure where that will land. And they are also asking the Worcester family for $150,000 to help with the planning costs associated with this project. So I'm mindful. I think I'm running over, so I don't I don't want to go too much longer. And I can answer any questions that you have about this piece or anything else. But I will kind of wrap it up here and just say, again, thank you so much to the First Amendment Museum for having me, and please take a look at the Monitor's website, and if you're not signed up for the Climate Monitor newsletter, I will be back writing it in mid-November after I'm back from maternity leave, and I hope you will sign up and read my writing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah.
So If anybody's watching this either on Facebook or on here on Zoom, please, if you have any questions for Kate, or if you have any questions that pop up as we kind of do our Q&A, please put them in the chat and we'll read those questions. So Kate, the first thing that I have a question about is I'm struck by sort of the amount of work that investigative journalists have to do, especially on topics they might not know anything about. You mentioned how you know anything about taxes. So when you're trying to figure out that information, where do you begin? I mean, do you read books, you talk to people, you read articles? So like what goes into that process to learn about, educate yourself in a field you know nothing about and report accurately on it?
Yeah. Well, so I have a basic rule of thumb, which is, try not to ask your interviewees, your sources, anything you could easily Google yourself. I'm really mindful when I interview people that they are taking time out of their day, often out of their work day to talk to me, and I'm really sensitive to that. So I try and do as much research beforehand. I am very proficient at deep Googling. I think you get good at kind of figuring out what sources are trustworthy and aren't. And I always have been a news junkie. I read the news all the time. I listen to podcasts. I'm constantly just learning about all kinds of things. And, I'm a reporter in the age of the internet, which is just, I have so many resources. I think oftentimes the challenge is to know when to stop. And so you can kind of fall down the rabbit hole of reading white papers, and sometimes it's too much. So, especially in the case of that tax story, I remember I was starting to get into the different methods of assessing, and I got just totally lost. And there is definitely a point at which you say, it's much more efficient and useful for me. I need to talk to a person now. So, that's when I pick up the phone and say, hey, like, help me with this. I really need some help. So I think oftentimes the challenge is too much information. Yeah.
And what do you do if you, as an investigative journalist, and I've heard stories of things like this, what do you do if someone doesn't want to talk or communicate that you feel like is important to talk to? How do you navigate that?
Oh, it's tricky, and it depends. Depends on the person, depends on the story. I did a piece about a mining development up in I'm sorry, not in Pembroke, up in Patten, Maine, not too long ago, and I really wanted to interview the CEO of the mining company, and I knew that he had been pretty reluctant to talk to the media. He'd gotten some bad press, and ever since it had, really just kind of shied away from interviews. But I thought it was really important that I talked to him. I mean, this is his project after all, and it didn't feel like a complete story without him. So I made I wrote a very thorough email, and I just explained. I said, I'm going to write about this regardless. I have all of these, here are some of the other people I've talked to. I tried to show, like, I have done my due diligence. I'm not going to waste your time. And, I also I think you really make the case that he was really vital to the story. And I think, oftentimes if you can explain to people how much work you've put in, and that you really are taking it seriously, and that you think that their perspective is essential, then, it gets a little bit easier, and that can kind of crack the door open. But there are sometimes people just don't want to talk to you. And I think it's also important to know when to stop. I mean, I certainly don't harass anybody. I mean, if they, we push a little bit and say, please come back to us if you reconsider, and, that kind of thing. But if they're really adamant, they're not going to talk to you. And you can only kind of keep making your case and hope that eventually they see the light, so to speak. But it is what it is, and you kind of have to you work around it as much as you can. I mean, if you still if you really have to go forward with the story, then you can certainly talk to people who know them. You can just, get as much information as you can around them. Yeah.
So one thing I'm curious about is, I don't know if you have any personal experience with this or if you know anybody that does, but what happens as a journalist when you make a mistake or you feel like you've accidentally maybe mischaracterized something or gotten the facts wrong, or maybe you regret framing something a certain way? And again, I don't know if you have any personal experience with this or if you know anybody that does, but if you don't, how would you deal with that? How would you sort of rebuild that trust or fix that issue that you think, because it's an immense amount of responsibility to do your job. So how do you navigate when you make mistakes, if you ever have, or if you thought you ever might?
Well, I am a person. We are journalists are all people first and foremost, so we all make mistakes. I have made plenty of them, and I think you know, you have to own it. And sometimes that is so hard. And my job is so public, and it's really difficult. But I think one of the things that makes journalism different from where you can really tell a good journalist, I would say, and a trustworthy journalist is somebody who does own their mistakes, and who will say, so if I do make a mistake, I mean, I really, I try very hard not to make those sort of little mistakes. I mean, we do a lot of fact checking. I check all, like for that Walmart tax story, I took all of the numbers I had in my spreadsheet and I sent, the figures for each town back to the towns themselves before we publish, just to say, hey, do I have this right? So that kind of thing, we really try to avoid that. I mean, like, I check all the names and numbers and dates. I mean, that doesn't mean we catch everything. There are still typos, things happen, but for the most part, you can avoid those. If somebody really feels as though we've gotten something, if we mischaracterize something, that's certainly trickier. I hope, I mean, we really hope that doesn't happen. And I tape record all of my interviews unless somebody objects. So I have that record to go back to, which is really helpful. But yeah, I mean, if somebody feels like we've mischaracterized something, I say, first of all, I say, I apologize, and I say it certainly wasn't my intention, because it never is my intention to do that. But I am human, and I might hear something one way, and they might mean it a different way, or there might just have been some kind of miscommunication. It certainly happens, and I apologize, and I say, I tell them where I'm coming from. I say, like, here's the information I was working with. But we can have a conversation about this. I've had some really difficult phone conversations with people. But I think if you're humble and you're genuinely sorry that they feel slighted or mischaracterized, most people either, we can get to an understanding. And if it really does, I mean, I talk to my editor, and if we together feel like, okay, this really was wrong or mischaracterized, then we will correct it. So that's another thing that kind of like sets a good journalist apart. Like, yes, we make mistakes, but you should correct them, and it should be the correction should be in an obvious place, and it should be really clear. So yeah, but sometimes you just have to have really hard conversations.
In your first slide, you mentioned you had some information and statistics on the death of local journalism, or at least the decline in local journalism. So can you kind of walk us through on a macro, or at least a statewide level, why is that important? Besides the obvious, why should we care? I've read all sorts of stuff that all sort of societal and social issues blamed on this phenomena of the death of local journalism. Can you give us some narrative of what's happening on the state level, or how this phenomenon is impacting us on the state or national level?
Yeah, I actually think Maine is in a better position than many states. We still have a fair number of daily and weekly newspapers, which I will tell you is pretty unusual and is really something to kind of cherish. I think all of those newspapers are really trying to figure out how to navigate the world where, where an advertising is not their main source of revenue anymore. But in terms of why it's important, I think, the two pieces I just mentioned are kind of a good example of it. I mean, nobody was at that Board of Appeals hearing. So if I hadn't gone, and if we hadn't, if the paper hadn't said, hey, this might be nothing, but it's important to have somebody there, that story might not have come out, or it might not have come out for years. Because it had already been happening for years, and it hadn't gotten any attention. So it just happened that because, the paper had a reporter who went to every meeting. I went to the planning board, I went to the school board, and they weren't always fruitful meetings. I mean, sometimes there was just not a whole lot to write about, but sometimes there was. And in those cases, it really brought attention to something that I think needed attention. And kind of the same case with this Worcester Reese story. I think that it had been out there a little bit, but it had kind of been flying under the radar. And I think, it's such a huge project, and it's, I guess, sort of for the people of Washington County to decide what they want, but it is a big project that will affect a lot of people. And so I think it deserves attention, and that's what local journalism can do. The New York Times is never going to come in to these small towns in Maine and cover these issues. And we're all so busy. As much as I love my town, I can't possibly go to all of the meetings in town, right? I just can't. We don't have time. So to have a local paper where somebody is actually paid to do that and paid to sit there, I just think that is, it's just so important. And it really, it's vital to kind of keeping democracy going. So, yeah.
Are there any unique challenges that Maine presents as a state in terms of investigative journalism? Are there any challenges that I don't know if you have any experiences in any other state, or if you've heard people in any other state? What are some of the unique challenges Maine presents to investigative journalists?
There are a couple. It's very rural. So, you were talking about kind of you mentioned all of the work that goes into this. It's a lot of work. You have to call so many people, and just going to these places. I did, like I mentioned, I went to the planning board meeting in Columbia Falls, and we're fortunate that I happen to be based on MDI, and so I'm only a couple of hours away. But, if we had a reporter in Augusta, that would have been a 4-hour trip. So the fact that it's rural is really difficult. And we are also, what we have found in our work at the Monitor is that Maine, the record keeping in Maine, at least the digital record keeping in Maine, really kind of lags behind some other states. So it's not as though it's impossible to get records. And I've actually found people at the state level to be really pretty receptive when I ask for information. They give it to me. I actually have not. I'm sure you've heard a lot about journalists using the Freedom of Information Act requests to get to get records. I haven't had to use it that often. I really, I go to the agencies, and for the most part, I've had a really pretty warm welcome, and they give me what I need. But oftentimes these records are, they are on, they're paper, or they're like scanned PDFs, and they're not, it's not digitized, it's not in any database, and it just makes it so that rather than kind of looking at something online and going through it, I have to do the work of putting the data into a spreadsheet. I worked on a piece not too long ago about the electronic waste recycling. And the DEP was wonderful. They gave me all kinds of records. They gave me a bunch of information, but it was, with scanned documents with handwriting on them from all these different towns. And so I had to go through every single one of these documents and essentially transfer them. And they were all handwritten. So, you know what reading other people's handwriting is like. So I'm going through all these documents and pulling all this information out and putting it into a spreadsheet. And it's really time consuming. So I think the rural nature of Maine and the fact that we are I would say a little behind in digitizing some of our records can make reporting here challenging.
I have a question from the chat. What do you think about having student journalists reporting on local issues?
I think that's great. I mean, I think student journalism is wonderful in any form. I would say they need guidance. And hopefully guidance of a well-trained journalist, because reporting on local issues can be complicated, and it can also really bring out some strong feelings. And if you're reporting on the community that you also live in, as I found working at the Ellsworth American, people are not shy about telling you what they think of your work. So I guess I would want somebody to really kind of guide them through not only the really how to responsibly report on local issues, which can be difficult. I mean, some of the cases that these local boards hear, can be really, really complicated. So you'd really want somebody to guide them, and somebody to make sure that they didn't get too much blowback from from hard stories. But no, I think it's great. I mean, we need more young people to go into this field. It is a difficult field. We hear a lot about how journalism is dying, which I actually don't believe. I don't think it is dying. I think that we really just are in this, like everything that changed with the internet, we're in just this huge transition phase, and we're working out how to navigate it. But no, I think that's great. Yeah, with some guidance, I think that's wonderful.
Hey, are you ever frightened during your work? I know when I read your bio, it mentioned some stuff about investigating like a white supremacist group or something. Is there ever an element of fear or at least anxiety in what you do and the stories you take on?
Um, I think my husband has maybe been more frightened for me than I have been. But yes, actually, that story in particular. So I wrote a piece about a man who, at that point, was in his mid 90s or late 90s, but he had been a good friend of George Rockwell. I'm sorry, the name I have a little bit of new mom brain, so forgive me. But he had been he was a Nazi, and he had been active in sort of the Nazi Party in the United States for decades, and he lived in Ellsworth, and I went to his house actually to interview him, and I remember he was kind of a nocturnal person, so he asked me to come at night, and he wanted me to come, I think, around like 7 or 8 in the evening, and it was winter, so it was very dark. And my editor, like, bless his heart, said, you can't go alone to this. So he came with me, and we drove to the house, and I remember we got out of the car and kind of walked up the driveway, and I had a few, for a second I was like, I don't know if this is a good idea, but there were plenty of people who knew where we were, and he was an older man. I wasn't too nervous about him kind of like physically hurting us, but it was unsettling, and he took us out at one point to like this shed that he had, and with a bunch of memorabilia in it, and like a rat ran across my foot, which really made me jump, but it wasn't, it was fine. And then after that story came out, we actually got a lot of blowback from people who knew him, but they knew him in a different capacity. They did not know his background, and they, they knew him as just kind of a nice old man, and they were really upset with us actually for kind of, in their view, like dredging up this past. But he still had some active white supremacist ties, and we felt it was an important story to publish, so we did. I never felt too nervous doing that, but my husband wasn't super thrilled. So.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you having you on. And is there any final thoughts? Any way people can learn more about the Maine Monitor, or any last, I guess, farewell messages?
No, I mean, support your local news organization, and support the Maine Monitor. You can read my work at the the mainemonitor.org. You just Google us. So I'm all over the internet. You can find me. And I like I said, I'm on maternity leave for another couple of weeks, but I will be back in November. And I love my daughter, but I'm very excited to get back to work. And I think, yeah, just if you have a newspaper in your town or city, cherish it. It's a really valuable resource, and support it financially, because that's what keeps me in my job, and keeps all of these reporters going. So yeah, and thank you so much, Max, and the First Amendment Museum. This is wonderful, and I please reach out if anybody has any questions. And yeah, it was wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight on Zoom and on Facebook. Please, next week, we have a screening of a wonderful documentary called Battleground about the current political divide in our country. So that's on November 3rd. So everybody, check out the First Amendment Museum website, social media for information on that and upcoming events. And again, Kate, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.